Did you know that global debt has reached a staggering $307 trillion as of 2023? That's almost 349% of the world's total GDP. Many countries owe more than they could ever realistically pay back, caught in a debt cycle they can't easily escape. Why do countries fall into these debt traps? And what strategies can they use to break free? Let's understand. Understanding how debt traps begin. The roots of debt traps for many countries can be traced back centuries, often starting with historical events like colonization and resource exploitation. During the colonial era, powerful nations extracted valuable resources from their colonies, depriving these regions of wealth and leaving them economically disadvantaged upon gaining independence. For example, India's economy is estimated to have lost nearly $45 trillion in today's currency due to British extraction of resources, which affected its long-term development. Similarly, many African nations were stripped of valuable minerals, leaving them economically vulnerable and, in many cases, financially dependent on their former colonizers. As these countries transitioned to independence, they often inherited not just economic instability, but existing debt burdens, or were forced to borrow to rebuild infrastructure that had been neglected or destroyed under colonial rule. Countries like Congo, once under Belgian rule, faced immense debt that impeded its growth for decades. Debt traps have also been created by financial crises. The nations have been forced into borrowing to balance their economies through the surveys such as through the 1997 Asian financial crisis. During this crisis, South Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia suffered a colossal amount of money and were forced to take bailout packages from the IMF, but on very harsh conditions. For example, Thailand's economy shrank by 10.5% in 1998, and the country had to rely on foreign credit. These crises do not simply erode short-term solvency, but they create long-term liabilities which keep the economy otherwise restrained for decades, effectively placing a nation into a cycle of repaying slavery. Other factors provoking situations that could potentially become debt traps are economic mismanagement, along with excessive focus on the processing of a single kind of product. Those countries that rely on such sensitive sectors as oil for Venezuela or tourism for small island states are in a very bad position when the market changes. Venezuela is a good example of this experience, whose economy, when oil prices were low, their economy suffered largely due to their dependency on oil, which led to a debt situation of nearly $150 billion. This put the country's economy vulnerable, unable to cope whenever there were changes in the price of oil in the international market, and pushed Venezuela into more borrowing to make up for the deficit. In the long run, such a type of economic vulnerability puts the countries at the mercy of international loans, deeper and deeper into the credit pit. Corruption is another factor that worsens debt traps by diverting funds away from critical economic needs. In some countries, government funds borrowed to build infrastructure or provide services end up in the hands of corrupt officials, rather than benefiting the people. For instance, in Mozambique, a secret $2 billion loan scandal in 2016 resulted in enormous debt, pushing the country into a financial crisis and triggering public backlash and loss of credibility. These kinds of scandals not only increase national debt, but also discourage foreign investment, leaving countries financially isolated and with fewer options to escape their debt traps. When corruption is systemic, it reduces a government's ability to manage resources effectively, often leading to further borrowing and deepening the debt cycle. Countries with high levels of imports and significant trade deficits frequently turn to borrowing to bridge these financial gaps, adding to their debt burden. Nations with limited industries or national resources find themselves needing to import essentials like food, technology, and manufactured goods. Egypt, for example, saw its trade deficit grow to $38 billion in 2022, forcing the government to rely on international loans, which increased the nation's debt load. Relying on imports creates a constant need for foreign currency, leaving nations vulnerable when their reserves are low. In such cases, high-interest loans often seem like the only solution, but they come with consequences that restrict the country's financial freedom. Another concerning factor is the functions of lending institutions, which phrase entails the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, in the debt trap practice. These institutions provide loans for the stabilization of economies, but the strings that come with their help slow down growth. For instance, most of the credit provided by the IMF is provided under conditions that force the borrowing country to cut on social spending, adjust taxes, or debase the local currency to boost exports. Such steps may alleviate the financial problems, at least in the short term, but they worsen poverty and social instability, and hence restrict future growth. In the 1980s, Zambia, among other African countries signing up for structural adjustment programs, spearheaded by the IMF, meant that spending on education and healthcare had to be reduced. In the long run, it not only arrested social advancement, but also economic decline. For example, Zambian average income per capita between 1980 and 2000 reduced by 20%. Debt servicing crowded out the capacity to invest in the economy, and the country was put into a cycle of debt. Also, most of the loans are offered at very high interest rates that enhance indebtedness more than the country's capacity to repay the debt. The debt burden is a problem that affects developing nations, and they spend more money on it than on health or education. The Jubilee Debt Campaign has estimated that low-income countries devote about 64% of their earnings towards paying off their external debts, thus leaving little for domestic growth. These payments result in the pressure to borrow more money, thus creating further room. Loan agreements may also have such conditions which hinder a nation's autonomy over its own interests. In some circumstances, restrictive terms are incorporated into loan agreements. The Sri Lankan government in 2018 surrendered its Hambantota port to China to avoid default and attained a 99-year lease, underpinning the Sino-Sri Lankan deal while highlighting the issue of national sovereignty and how the debt causes the loss of the economy's control. Debt trap examples. Debt traps are situations where countries get stuck in cycles of borrowing, making it hard to escape debt. Argentina, Greece, and Zambia are three examples of how different factors, such as poor economic choices, outside pressures, and complex political issues, can push nations into deep, seemingly unmanageable debt. In Argentina, debt troubles go back decades. After a military dictatorship, Argentina returned to democracy in the 1980s, but it inherited a lot of debt from the past. To fight high inflation, the country pegged its currency to the US dollar, making its goods more expensive in global markets and slowing down trade. During the 1990s, Argentina borrowed heavily to keep its economy going, and by 2001, it owed about $100 billion, which was 55% of its GDP. When the country ran out of money, it couldn't pay its debt, leading to what was then the largest government debt default in history. This default triggered years of economic hardship, including job losses and high poverty. International aid from the IMF came with strict rules, like spending cuts, which hurt the economy further. Even today, Argentina faces recurring debt problems, showing how difficult it can be to break out of the debt cycle. Greece's debt crisis started in the 2000s after it joined the Eurozone and borrowed heavily at low interest rates to pay for public sector wages, pensions, and projects. This led to a large government deficit, and by 2009, Greece's debt was over 130% of its GDP. When Greece struggled to get new loans, it turned to the European Union and IMF for help, receiving multiple bailout packages totaling about 260 billion euros. These bailouts came with strict conditions, such as raising taxes and cutting pensions, which led to widespread protests and worsened the recession. Between 2008 and 2013, Greece's economy shrank by over 25%, and unemployment reached 27.5%. Today, Greece's debt remains high, at around 190% of GDP. This crisis highlights how measures meant to fix finances can backfire, reducing consumer spending and worsening the economy. Zambia is a more recent example from Africa, showing how reliance on a single resource and foreign loans can lead to debt problems. Zambia is rich in copper, which makes up 70% of its export income. In the 2010s, Zambia borrowed a lot of money to fund infrastructure projects, expecting copper prices to remain high. But when global copper prices dropped, Zambia's income fell, making it harder to pay off its debt. By 2020, Zambia owed over $12 billion, or 120% of its GDP, with interest payments taking up more than 30% of its government revenue. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Zambia couldn't keep up with its debt payments and became the first African country to default. Most of its debt was owed to Chinese lenders with complex repayment terms, which made it harder for Zambia to control its finances. Now, Zambia is negotiating with creditors while cutting public spending. This shows how relying on unpredictable resources and high-interest loans can trap countries in debt. In each of these cases, debt traps are caused by a mix of economic policies, dependency on certain industries, and difficult international lending conditions that make recovery very challenging. The impact of debt traps. The consequences of debt traps extend far beyond government budgets, deeply impacting citizens' quality of life, a country's economic trajectory, and its position on the global stage. When countries are entrenched in debt cycles, the effects ripple through society, weakening social services, limiting economic growth, and reducing national autonomy. Each of these areas reflects the broader, often devastating costs of debt dependence. For citizens, debt traps often mean cuts to essential social services. Governments facing high debt obligations are forced to prioritize debt repayments over spending on healthcare, education, and infrastructure. In Greece, for instance, years of austerity measures, required to meet the terms of bailout agreements, resulted in dramatic reductions in public spending. Hospital budgets were slashed by 40%, leading to shortages of basic supplies and understaffing that compromised the quality of healthcare. Similarly, education funding was curtailed, with many schools lacking adequate resources, leaving students and families to bear the cost of budget cuts. The lack of social investment exacerbates poverty and inequality, as vulnerable communities face declining access to basic services. Unemployment also rises, often reaching double digits, as governments struggle to create jobs or stimulate growth under debt burdens. In Argentina, a prolonged recession due to debt default in the early 2000s saw poverty rates skyrocket to nearly 60% in some regions, leading to widespread hardship and social unrest. For everyday citizens, debt traps translate into lower standards of living, job instability, and fewer social support systems. At the national economic level, debt traps lead to reduced growth potential, limited investment, and weaker trade capabilities. When debt repayment consumes a large portion of national revenue, fewer funds are available for economic development, such as building infrastructure, supporting innovation, or investing in critical industries. For countries like Zambia, where nearly 30% of government revenue is allocated to debt payments, the opportunity to develop new industries and create jobs is severely restricted. As a result, economies remain reliant on limited sectors, creating a cycle of vulnerability to external market shifts. Additionally, debt-ridden countries find it difficult to attract foreign investment. Investors view heavy debt loads as risks, fearing instability or potential defaults, which can result in capital flight and a declining business environment. This lack of investment limits economic growth, preventing countries from generating the wealth needed to pay down their debts sustainably. Over time, high debt levels reduce the ability of a nation to engage in beneficial trade agreements. Countries with weak economies are often forced to export raw materials at low prices, missing the opportunity to profit from higher value goods that come with stronger trade networks. Internationally, countries caught in debt traps become increasingly dependent on wealthier nations and international institutions, leading to a significant loss of economic sovereignty. Debt-ridden countries often rely on loans from institutions like the IMF or wealthier nations, which may impose strict terms that limit a nation's control over its economy. In Sri Lanka's case, massive debt obligations to Chinese lenders resulted in a 99-year lease of the Hambantota port of China, an arrangement that many viewed as a loss of national control over a vital asset. This dependency creates a power imbalance in international relations, where debtor countries have limited leverage and face restrictions on policy decisions, including trade regulations, currency valuations, and even domestic budgeting priorities. Escaping a debt trap is challenging and requires tough choices, planning, and strong leadership. Many countries have shown that it is possible to escape debt and grow stronger by restructuring loans, creating new industries, and rethinking high-interest borrowing. Stories like those of South Korea and Malaysia give hope that, with commitment and smart strategies, countries can overcome even the toughest debt situations. As global financial pressures grow, one important question remains. With so many countries struggling with debt, what new solutions might they find to finally break free? Break free.